Today, we're continuing the Italian theme, as voted on by Patreon supporters, and we're looking at a three-engine Italian bomber that served in World War II. And no, I'm sorry to disappoint you, it's not the Savoia Marchetti SM-79. It's this, the Caproni Ca.133. Now, what the heck is that, you ask, and why are you doing a half-hour video on it? Well, this inelegant machine is perhaps the most underappreciated aircraft that was operated by the Italian Air Force during the interwar/World War II period that this channel mostly covers. The Caproni Ca.133 was a three-engine, high-wing, medium-sized aircraft that was developed by Aeroplani Caproni in Italy. Designed as both a colonial bomber and a transport, it became one of the Regia Aeronautica's most widely used, and, let's be honest, most repurposed planes. It was also the last aircraft personally designed by Giovanni Caproni, the legendary founder of the Caproni Company, marking the end of an era. Praised for its rugged construction and ease of piloting, the Ca.133 earned a solid reputation among its aircrews. In service, it did a little bit of everything: bombing, transport, medical evacuation, paratrooper training, and liaison duties. Its simplicity and durability meant it could take off from just about any patch of dirt that was large enough to be classified as an airstrip, which made it a true workhorse of the Italian colonial air forces. However, with the aerodynamic grace of a wheelbarrow and performance figures that wouldn't impress a pigeon, it was, quite wisely, kept away from high-intensity combat operations. Well, mostly anyway. This of course means that it doesn't get much of a mention in the history books, except perhaps in footnotes about planes that were good enough, but not great. Now, despite some sources and websites claiming that this aircraft began life as an airliner, it did not. The origins of the Ca.133 are rooted in the political and military ambitions of fascist Italy. The Ca.133 prototype was conceived in 1934 as part of Italy's broader strategy to strengthen its military air power in anticipation of colonial expansion, particularly the planned invasion of Ethiopia. The development of the Ca.133 was led by Giovanni Caproni, with significant contributions from his assistant, Agostino Carati. The design of the prototype took elements from two previous, and related, Caproni aircraft: the three-engine Ca.101 airliner, and the single-engine Ca.111, which was a reconnaissance aircraft and light bomber. Both of those designs could trace their origins back to the Ca.97, which was a design from the latter half of the 1920s. The prototype was internally designated as the Matricola Militaire 283, and it was constructed at Milan's Taliedo airfield. It took to the air for the first time on September 16, 1934, with test pilot Mario De Bernardi at the controls. In comparison to some other designs that were coming out of Italy in the mid-1930s, a time that saw the Regia Aeronautica looking to modernize its fleet, the Ca.133 appears to be somewhat of a step backwards, as it looks completely conservative and old-fashioned. It made use of a simple semi-cantilever wing supported by thick struts, rather than the full cantilever wings that were now becoming commonplace. It utilized mixed construction, with the fuselage being built around a basic steel tube frame, whereas the two-spar wing was primarily constructed from wood. And, most obvious of all, it made use of a thick, drag-inducing fixed undercarriage. But these design choices were not the result of a conservative design philosophy shunning innovation at every turn. They were calculated for the environment in which the aircraft would operate. Caproni had been informed that Africa would be his aircraft's destination, and he had designed accordingly. The fixed landing gear, though bulky, was simple, robust, and easy to maintain, making it ideal for rough airstrips in far-flung colonial outposts. The 1.1 meter wheels were housed in streamlined fairings, they came with pneumatic brakes, and had powerful hydraulic shock absorbers. The airframe itself was simple and easy to both construct and repair. Now, this was especially important as, like discussed in our video on the Fiat BR20, Italy didn't have the largest aircraft industry in the world, and keeping things simple would mean they would be able to build more of them in a shorter period of time. The engine layout had also been influenced by the aircraft's intended destination. The aircraft was powered by 3 air-cooled radial engines, specifically the Piaggio P7. This was a 19.3-litre 7-cylinder engine that produced approximately 460 horsepower. These were relatively lightweight, reliable, and simple enough to maintain in remote locations with minimal equipment. The choice of 3 engines also meant that if one engine failed, the aircraft could still fly at cruising speed with a full bomb load, and, more importantly, still make it back to base in the event of any emergency. The prototype's basic design also had another benefit. There were less things to go wrong during testing. After his first few flights, De Bernardi gave the prototype a very favourable review. It was easy to fly, had minimal engine vibrations, unlike the poor Fiat BR20, and it had excellent downward visibility for takeoff and landing, again particularly important for rough airstrips. The transition from prototype to production was unusually rapid due to military pressures. The Italian Ministry of Aviation made the decision to proceed with serial production even before the flight testing of the prototype was fully completed. Now, this was of course influenced by the urgency of reinforcing Italy's military presence in East Africa ahead of the invasion of Abyssinia/Ethiopia. Based on feedback from the prototype's test flights, minor modifications were made to enhance the structural integrity and ease of maintenance of the airframe, particularly the wing-to-fuselage attachment points, but aside from that, the changes were minimal. During this time, and after production had got underway, a few alternative designs were also proposed by Caproni, but for one reason or another they were never approved for mainline production. There was the Ca.133 bis, which was to be powered by 2 Asso liquid-cooled engines, and driving 3-blade propellers. However, this design was rejected due to concerns about maintaining liquid-cooled engines in the harsh African climate. There was also the Ca.141, a design which featured 2 880 horsepower Gnome K14 engines, which were air-cooled radials like the ones it normally comes with. But this was abandoned due to the complexity of those engines and cost considerations. Then there was the Ca.142, of which one prototype was eventually built. This was an attempt to equip the Ca.133 with a retractable landing gear, but this was later on abandoned due to issues with the reliability of said gear mechanism. During field trials in Mogadishu, the retraction system proved to be so recalcitrant that a decision was made to fix the gear in the down position permanently. Now, getting back to the Caproni Ca.133 itself, the type entered serial production in December of 1935, and it would remain in production until April of 1937. A total of 417 Ca.133s would be built, including one prototype and various models which were later adopted for bombing, transport, medical evac, and paratrooper training. Of the main production models, there was the Ca.133, often known as the Ca.133N, which was the initial bomber variant. Then there was the Ca.133T, which was the transport variant, which could carry up to 18 fully equipped soldiers. Then there was the Ca.133S. This was a medical evacuation version, which was equipped to carry 6 stretchers and medical staff. Then there was the Ca.133P, which was the paratrooper training variant, which had modified engine nacelles to make parachute exiting safer. And then there was the Ca.133C, which was a civilian passenger version that was used by the airline Alla Littoria, mostly in East Africa. The initial version, the Ca.133 bomber, usually had a crew of 4, a pilot, a co-pilot/navigator, a radio operator, and a defensive gunner. It could carry up to 1,200 kilograms of bombs, which were stored in a mix of internal and external configurations. There were 2 bomb bays in the fuselage, which were located behind the pilots, which could house up to 6 50-kilogram high-explosive bombs. These were stored in vertical positions. Behind this, there was also the option to install a case, or a cassette, which contained 102 small anti-personnel bombs, usually weighing around 2 kilos each. On the underside of the fuselage, there were 2 large external racks, which could also accommodate a pair of 500 kilo bombs in addition to the internal load. For defense, there were 4 7.7mm machine guns installed in single positions. They were all situated around the same location in the fuselage, behind the wing. There were 2 side positions, a dorsal and a ventral position. The latter 2 would be installed in slightly different types of turret configuration depending on when the aircraft was made. The aircraft had just 1 dedicated gunner though, which would make things a little bit challenging if the Ca-133 was attacked from multiple angles, but the radio operator could serve as a second gunner if needed. Additionally, defense wasn't a huge concern, as the Ca-133 was to be operated in regions where enemy aircraft were either negligible or, ideally, non-existent. In service, the Ca-133 had quite the eventful career, serving in multiple roles across multiple wars, thanks to its versatility, and, more importantly, Italy's occasional lack of better options. During the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, the Ca-133 was the main bomber aircraft slated for operation, as had been the plan from the start. Italy did have other bombers available, but the Regia Aeronautica held them back. The more advanced Savoia Marchetti SM-81 and Fiat BR-20 were deemed far too valuable to be wasted on such a minor campaign. The first Ca-133s were delivered to Italy's 14th Air Regiment on December 31st, 1935, replacing the already outdated Fiat BR-3 biplanes. During the Ethiopian campaign, they were flown by bomber groups 44, 45, and 49 under the 14th and 7th Air Regiments. The plan was to send 40 of them to Eritrea by the end of 1935, with over 100 to follow over the next year. The main hub for operations was to be Kufra Airfield, where Captain Aldo Ramondino oversaw the construction of new facilities and an improved runway. The first batch of aircraft arrived on December 5th, 1935, ahead of plan. However, getting the rest there proved to be far more difficult, as the British, who were not particularly thrilled about Italy having its own colonial ambitions, refused to let the Italian bombers fly over Sudan. This forced Italy to transport them by sea instead, causing significant delays. In fact, by the time the full shipment of 171 Ca-133s was finally completed in March 1937, the war they were meant to fight in was already over. However, enough had still been delivered by the start of hostilities for them to have something of an impact. The 44th Group was combat ready by January 2nd, 1936. By February 16th, its Ca-133s were attacking Ethiopian forces retreating from Mount Amba Aradam. These aircraft saw a lot of service over a quite short period of time. On February 16th alone, a day which was later commemorated in Italy as Aviation Day, the 44th Group conducted 170 sorties, dropping 73 tons of bombs and firing 13,000 rounds of ammunition. Due to the absence of enemy aircraft and any concentrated anti-aircraft fire other than some scattered small arms fire, the bombers were able to operate with near impunity. In one rarer event when a Ca-133 actually got into trouble, on March the 18th, flight engineer Mario Tadini, despite being seriously wounded, kept a damaged Ca-133 airborne, allowing it to return safely to base. He was awarded the Medaglia d'Oro for his efforts, becoming the only Ca-133 crew member to be honoured during the entire campaign. On the Somali front, the 45th Group received its CA-133s in Mogadishu in March of 1936. General Ferruccio Ranza used them for long-range reconnaissance, including aerial photography of Addis Ababa on March the 6th. They were later assisted by the 49th Group, which joined combat on March the 13th, who spent much of their time dropping propaganda leaflets, particularly over the capital in the early weeks of April. Now, during this time, the Capronis serving in this theatre also had the ill distinction of being among the number of Italian bombers to employ the use of chemical weapons. They were frequently equipped with mustard gas and phosgene chemical bombs, forbidden by the 1925 Geneva Protocol. These weapons were often used as a method of breaking through enemy lines, either during a major assault or in some rarer cases to help besieged Italian garrisons break out from being surrounded by their numerically superior but technologically inferior opponents. Along with bombing the near-enough defenseless enemy below, the CA-133s were also employed in their non-combatant roles. In March and May of 1936, Italy deployed 7 unarmed CA-133 ambulance aircraft, each capable of carrying up to 10 wounded soldiers. These would be used extensively. As an example, in August of 1936, they successfully transported 37 wounded and over 200 sick personnel. These ambulances, and some other CA-133 transport variants, also helped transport troops to Dessie in preparation for the final push on Addis Ababa. By May the 5th, the city fell to Italian forces, and Ethiopia would be officially annexed into Italian East Africa. Despite Italy's claim of victory, Ethiopian resistance would continue, and CA-133s were frequently used in counter-insurgency operations. One notable incident occurred on June the 27th, 1936, near the village of Bonaya. 3 CA-133s landed with a 14-man Italian expedition, led by General Magliocco. The group was attacked overnight by 500 Ethiopian fighters under Commander Nasibu, resulting in the deaths of all Italians and the destruction of their aircraft. By 1938, most anti-Italian forces had been defeated, but it had not been without cost. In 1937, Italian forces lost 27 CA-133s in East Africa. Another 13 were lost between 1938 and 1939, and 6 more in early 1940. The CA-133's role in the Italo-Ethiopian War established it as the most successful colonial aircraft of the Regia Aeronautica, leading to its extensive deployment in subsequent colonial and wartime operations. Sometimes they were successful in this, sometimes they weren't, and this all came down to the combat intensity of the areas in which they were operated. For example, their next outing during the Spanish Civil War did not go well. The CA-133 formed part of the Legionary Air Force that was deployed to assist Franco's nationalist forces. It did not take long for everyone to realize that a bomber designed for colonial pacification, i.e. a war in which the enemy had zero air force, wasn't going to do so well when it came against a determined aerial opposition. The CA-133 had a top speed of only 230 km per hour, making it one of the slowest aircraft on the battlefield. This lack of speed made it easy prey for Republican fighters, particularly the Soviet-supplied Polikarpov I-15 and the significantly more advanced I-16, which could easily outrun and outmaneuver the slow Caproni. Also, in contrast to Ethiopia, where the CA-133 operated without much interference from the ground at all, in Spain it encountered well-organized anti-aircraft defenses and losses mounted quickly. Due to its poor performance in contested airspace, the CA-133 was quickly withdrawn from frontline combat roles. Instead, it was reassigned for logistical and support duties, including troop transport, moving nationalist forces between bases, cargo and supply transport, delivering ammunition and supplies to the front lines, as well as medical and emergency evacuation. But even in these roles, the aircraft remained highly vulnerable and they suffered heavy losses. Thus, by 1938, most remaining CA-133s had been pulled out of the Spanish theatre, and they were replaced by the SM-81 and the SM-79, which became the primary Italian aircraft of the campaign. With its poor showing in Spain, it would be understandable to assume that the CA-133 performed even worse following Italy's involvement in the Second World War. But this wasn't always the case. Indeed, on the whole, and considering the circumstances, it did quite well. At the outbreak of war, more than 250 CA-133s were still in service, many stationed in Italy's far-flung territories. While most were relegated to cargo and medical transports, some saw combat in East Africa, where the enemy opposition was, let's say, limited, at least for the time being. When Italy entered the war on the 10th of June 1940, its East African possessions found themselves in a rather awkward position, completely cut off from the Italian mainland and surrounded by British-controlled territories, namely Sudan, Kenya, and British Somaliland. With few aircraft available, the CA-133 was pressed into offensive duties, with the misplaced argument being that the British colonial air units must also be about as poorly equipped and outdated as they were. Starting on June the 12th, 1940, the CA-133s carried out bombing missions against Allied targets, mostly airfields and poorly defended convoys. On the night of June the 12th to the 13th, 10 of them, alongside SM-81s, attacked the port of Aden and the Khor Maksar airfield in British Yemen. Meanwhile, others struck Kassala airfield in Sudan. In a rare moment of glory, a CA-133 even managed to shoot down an Avro Anson, flying for No. 60 South African Air Force Squadron in January of 1941. However, the good times did not last. By early 1941, British and Commonwealth forces launched a major counter-offensive, and the situation deteriorated rapidly. With Hawker Hurricanes now in the skies, the CA-133 went from being mildly vulnerable to flying target practice overnight. The Hurricanes had very little trouble shooting them down, and by the end of April, only 4 were still operational. And instead of being surrendered, they were, for some reason, hidden away in a cave. In other theatres of the war, the CA-133 served in secondary roles where it saw more success. In North Africa, the CA-133 was primarily used as a transport, ferrying supplies, equipment, and reinforcements to the front lines. It also played a critical role in medical evacuations, especially after Italy suffered major losses in the Western Desert Campaign. As British and American forces gained total air superiority in 1942 to 1943, the CA-133 became increasingly vulnerable to interception, but it still carried on its mission. Unsurprisingly, many were destroyed on the ground during Allied air raids, while others were abandoned as the Axis gradually retreated from Libya in 1943. Outside of Africa, the type also saw use in the Balkans and the Eastern Front. In April 1941, Italy participated in the Axis invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece. The CA-133 would see use as a transport and medical evacuation aircraft, as well as that of a paratrooper training aircraft. Now at this point, most of the CA-133s operated in the theatre were the 133T, the troop transport, as it was the most produced variant, and could be easily refitted to carry cargo or medical equipment instead of just soldiers. Now, predictably, because it would have been shocking otherwise, the CA-133's worst performance during the war was on the Russian front. In 1941, the Italian army in Russia, realizing that its logistical capabilities were as underwhelming as its winter equipment, requested additional transport aircraft. This led to the deployment of at least 4 CA-133 medical evacuation planes in August, tasked with ferrying Italian and German wounded from the front lines. Unfortunately, the Russian winter had other ideas. The CA-133s, like the Fiat BR-20s, designed for milder climates, struggled to function in the extreme cold. Their engines stopped working, and their crews were slowly freezing to death. By April 1943, as Italy wisely decided to withdraw, the remaining aircraft were reassigned to homeland defense, where there at least the snow was slightly less aggressive. By mid-1943, the CA-133 had been more or less withdrawn from frontline service, though a few lingered on in training, transport, and ambulance duties, refusing to retire entirely. When Italy signed the armistice with the Allies on September 8, 1943, the fleet of CA-133s remaining found itself in something of an identity crisis. About 40 were captured by the Germans and pressed into Luftwaffe transport roles. A handful served the Italian Social Republic for liaison and supply runs, and a few even ended up in the hands of the Allies, where they were repurposed for local transport duties, likely bewildering anyone who was expecting something a bit more modern. A year later, and by the end of 1944, the last of the CA-133s were finally retired from normal operations. But a few were kept on as liaison aircraft, and some of these were the rare but newer variant, the CA-148. This was a stretched transport derivative of the CA-133, developed to meet the increasing demand for greater passenger and cargo capacity. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, the Regia Aeronautica, and to an extent the Italian commercial aircraft industry, needed a larger, more capable version of the CA-133 to fulfill both military and civilian transport roles. Only 54 were built, and due to the outbreak of war, it saw almost zero civil use until after war's end. The Italian Air Force retained a few of these CA-148s for liaison duties after the war, and a few were still flying by 1950. A small number were also used for civilian transport use, mainly by private aviation clubs and charter operators. No known complete CA-133 aircraft survives today. However, some parts and components are preserved in aviation museums in Italy. Though not as advanced as its contemporaries in the Regia Aeronautica, the CA-133 was one of the more important multi-engine aircraft it used, alongside the SM-79. But because most of its important wartime responsibilities were logistical in nature, it rarely got the recognition it deserves. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you of course to the Patreon supporters. Right, I am back to doing YouTube full-time now, my contract is up, so things will finally be returning to normal. Right after this whole cyclone thing has passed over my house. Yeah, that's not going to be fun, it's already getting a bit windy outside. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier patrons, our highest tier supporters. And I know it's been a while, but I am working on the airship development video, I promise. I know you all voted on it a little while ago, but it's sort of devolved into a multi-hour monster. However, I am going for quality over quantity, so that's probably not really a bad thing. Hopefully it should be ready to upload quite soon though. But as always, thank you all so much for your continued support, and I will catch you all next time. Goodbye.